Hello, I'm Michael Igoe, Global Development Reporter at Devex. I'm joined today by Toily Kurbanov, who is the United Nations Development Program's Myanmar Country Director. Toily, thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So, Myanmar is really the hot topic in international development these days. Virtually every NGO, every donor is looking to boost its presence in the country, implement new programs, and try to drive some really important but challenging reforms. How is the UNDP's approach different from what other donors are doing? What value do you bring to the Myanmar development scene that others don't?
Well, we had, Michael, our own set of organizational challenges to prepare the organization to provide the most meaningful support possible to people in the government of Myanmar as they go ahead with the reform process. The fact is that UNDP had stayed in the country throughout the sanctions regime. We had a very limited mandate by the decision of the Executive Board of UNDP. UNDP was only allowed to work at the grassroots level and was not allowed to engage the military government, which is understandable. Then, as the sanctions were gradually lifted, UNDP was allowed to restore its full mandate. So for us, the challenge was to adapt to the realities and to the new sets of challenges. We had, as I said, the continued presence in the country. In fact, because we work at the grassroots level, we had arguably some of the most vast networks of operations throughout the country. So the work for us was to try to transit from the old state of UNDP. We're working mostly at the grassroots level, providing livelihood support to the communities, to free up that space to the non-governmental organizations who can do this work in this new environment just as well as we can, and perhaps even better than we can, and to focus instead on the areas that seem to be within the UNDP's comparative advantage or respond to our expertise, relate to our expertise around the world. So we had to leave that state and move to the new UNDP for New Myanmar. And the new UNDP for New Myanmar is a development organization that is there to support the government, the civil society, and the people of Myanmar to tackle some of the most important reform challenges. In particular, in our case, the reforms in the areas of governance. So, as you might know, the way the national stakeholders in Myanmar are framing the development agenda or the reform agenda often has to do with what they refer to as the 4 waves of reforms. The Thein Sein's administration had promulgated the first wave of reform, which was about the political reforms, creating independent judiciary, independent parliament, and coming to peace agreement with non-state ethnic armed groups, rather. The second wave of reform is socio-economic reforms. The third wave is the governance administrative reforms, and the fourth wave is the private sector development, private sector reforms. Through our work in the area of governance, we're trying to provide inputs to the reform agenda and help the government and the partners to unpack the reform agenda and to bring technical expertise to advance on 3 out of 4 waves of reforms. Obviously, UNDP is not the best actor possible to engage in private sector development. That job is better left to the private sector itself. But we're working with the government and with opposition and the civil society on the first wave of reform by helping to develop the capacity of the parliament, both at the union and the regional level, by helping to improve rule of law and access to justice, and also by providing livelihood support in some of the remote ethnic areas or the border areas with the view of contributing to the social cohesion. So it's not the livelihood support for the sake of livelihood support, which is again the job that could be done by others better than us, but it's the conflict-sensitive, tension reduction type of intervention where the livelihood support is a means to achieving that outcome.
Right.
In the area of socio-economic reforms, we've been working with the government in helping them to articulate the National Comprehensive Development Plan and also the regional development plans. There we're partnering with other organizations that have recognized expertise in this area, such as the Asian Development Bank. And we're also, in parallel to that, working with the government and with the World Bank to help them to strengthen their statistical systems. So these are still the governance interventions that aim to support the governance capacity, but the governance for the economic policy planning. And finally, the third wave of reform, where we have very active engagement, is the administrative reforms. There we're working with the government at all levels and with the civil society to promote capacity development of local governments and of the local civil society, and to do it in a way that contributes to changing the behavioral patterns whereby the administrative services or the governance functions provided by the local authorities are provided in a way that responds to the most immediate needs of the communities. Mm-hmm. So transforming the systems of governance from top-down kind of directive approach to one that is more participatory and has some performance systems that allow them to create some incentives for the administrative services to be provided in the interest of the population.
Right.
So that's more or less how we see our work in the area of governance complemented with work of all other partners can contribute to the reform agenda.
Great. On that last point, what are you starting with? I mean, is it a completely blank slate in terms of participatory government for, advocating for those administrative services? Or was there sort of a nascent democratic participation regime in place that you're able to build on? I mean, how dramatic is this change that we're talking about? I wonder if you could sort of paint the picture of what democratic participation looks like in some of these places.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's the question we keep asking ourselves all the time. I'm afraid we don't have the full answer. But what I can say, Michael, is that it seems, and this is at risk of oversimplification to some extent, it seems that in the area of governance and the local administration, there's been two schools of thought, two perspectives. One perspective articulated by some members of the administration in that we're doing just fine. We don't need to change anything. We've been running this country for so many years. Well, maybe a workshop here and there, that's good enough. We don't need anything else. Right. And the opposite perspective, often articulated by development partners, but not only by them, is that of the subnational government, the local administrations are just hopeless. Nothing is working, they're dysfunctional, and they're not working at all. So we felt that our job as a development agency working on behalf of the United Nations is to try to nuance these two perspectives and to try to help the government and the civil society and other actors to see the issue, the problem, not in black and white terms, but recognize, at risk of using cliche here, recognize different shades of gray. So what we've started with is the baselining, the good old baselining that anybody needs to do before we embark on anything. And the baselining in this case is about local governance mapping across all 14 states and regions, where we look at two aspects. We look at the supply side of the local governance, that is the capacity of the local governments themselves, that we try to measure through their own self-assessment and also some analysis and research. But on the other hand, we're also looking at the demand side in each state and region and asking communities about their perceptions and their expectations of the service to be provided to them by the local authorities. So we call it community scorecards. And we hope that through this baselining process of the local governance mapping process, we will develop, as it were, sort of a photographic picture as what is in reality the state of the governance at the subnational level. We've done just two of those local governance mappings so far in Chin State on the east of the country, which is arguably the most poor state of Myanmar, and in Mon State in the southeast of the country. And we're so ambitious that we're hoping to finish all the local governance mapping exercises across the entire country by the end of the year. And they will bring all this data, all this baseline together with a view of informing the government at all levels as to what are their arguably capacity strengths and what are the areas for improvement or the clear capacity gaps,
right,
and how that needs to be considered before the government articulates decentralization reform or any other policy priorities.
Right. And have you found that Myanmar's government is receptive to that kind of feedback about how they're performing and whether they are open to democratic participation? I mean, is it a receptive partnership, and do you get the sense that members of ministries and members of the government are interested in getting that kind of information from the UNDP?
Well, two things. One, this is a little bit outside of their comfort zone. There's no question about that. But two, no government, as you would know, Michael, is ever monolithic. So within the government, there are some people who are more open-minded, who could be seen as the change agents,
right,
who would be quite happy, actually, to get as much of this feedback as possible because they can reflect on it and on that basis to develop more sort of evidence-based reform priorities. And there are others who are not exactly fully comfortable with that. So our job as development partners, and not only UNDP, but also the others, is try to, through this local governance mapping on other similar initiatives, to the extent possible, to empower those who are the change agents with knowledge, with tools, with the expertise, but at the same time also do it in a way that make sure that other elements within the government or outside of the government who are not necessarily that eager to go down this path, that they become part of the solution, not part of the problem. So empowering change engines is important, but also we need to reach out to the others.
Right.
And we've been doing that so far. On the local governance mapping, we've gone through various phases of the process. And as you would imagine, it was a bit more tense at the beginning, but by now we believe we had established critical mass of interactions between ourselves and local governments, between them and the civil society, that is already in a ways expanding everybody's comfort zone.
Great, great. So returning to the bigger picture slightly, you spoke about these 4 sort of waves of reform that Myanmar's government has itself sort of come up with as the way forward. Are those as clearly sequenced as sort of a 4-waved approach would make it sound? Or is there sort of just an overall demand that all of these things happen right away? We've heard from various organizations and individuals who have spent some time in Myanmar that, there's so much to do and maybe less focus on how to prioritize one reform after another. It's, every sector has a new law that needs to be developed. Do you see that coordination happening? And maybe is the UNDP working to make sure that it happens better?
Yeah, the 4 ways of reforms is a device, is a framework of reference that is out there to serve a particular purpose. Even though it is implicit in the 4 ways of reforms that one should follow the other, I think there is a recognition both within the government and outside of the government that some of these reforms need to proceed in parallel. I mean, the development is never linear. It never go from point A to point B to point C in a direct fashion. I think that the same notion applies to the way the reforms have been conceived and implemented in Myanmar. That is not to say that the reforms need to be sequenced. They do need to be sequenced. But one needs to be realistic to understand that in that context where everything is important, some of these reforms will have to proceed in parallel. And what needs to happen, and there may be where sequencing is important, the reforms need to generate tangible benefits for the people. What the government and others often refer to as quick wins. Not for the sake of achieving quick wins, but more importantly, through achieving quick wins to expand the reform coalition and to make sure that the reform process does not fizzle out.
Great. And maybe you could just sort of locate us within that process. Are we still at the very beginnings of the reform effort, or have there been, a series of quick wins and we're already fairly well along? Is there a lot of momentum, or are we still trying to generate buy-in? Where are we in this process?
Well, some, including myself and few of our other colleagues and partners in the development community, believe that the government and the partners of the government, which includes the opposition, because the opposition is playing quite a constructive role, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, by making sure that they keep government on their toes, and also they articulate the demands of the population. So both the government and other partners outside of the government who are interested in the reform process. In our view, this group of people, they have gone with the reform process in 3 years, probably as fast as possible. I mean, Myanmar is coming out of 50 years of darkness, and we need to recognize that they won't be able to solve all of the problems in the 3 years, but they've solved quite a lot, to give the credit to the reform champions. I think few examples that often hit the headlines are the unification of the exchange rate and reducing the trade barriers and tariffs that had led to gradual opening up of the economy, establishing an independent central bank. In the area of governance, Parliament had become a fully functioning body that provides checks and balances to the government. The state authorities are now a bit more empowered than they used to be before, in facing the expectations, meeting the demands of the population. On the peace process, I mean, they've done a lot of work to conclude ceasefire agreements. Of course, there's always a glass half empty perspective as well, but I think we need to recognize the things that had happened in the country over the last 3 years.
Sure.
And to put things into perspective, I mean, it's not right, as you would know, to compare one country with another, but sometimes the parallels are useful. And just to remind ourselves that this country is only 3 years in the reform process. And if you apply the same matrix to China's reforms after Deng Xiaoping announced reforms in 1980, they're still in the year 1983. So I think Myanmar had achieved quite a lot in 3 years, but it will be important in the period between now and the next elections and beyond that these reforms, the gains of the reforms have been consolidated and there's sufficient momentum in place that will help to carry forward to the reform process in the future.
And do you think Myanmar's citizens have that same patient perspective where they recognize that, for a process that's 3 years old, things are moving along pretty well and they should stay engaged and stay supportive of the effort? Is there a general buy-in into the success that you're describing?
I would be the last to pretend that I can read fully the sentiments of the people.
Fair enough.
But I can maybe refer to several anecdotes. I've been, because this is my job to, get to know the real situation on the ground, not only engage in Naypyidaw or in Yangon. I've traveled now to all the 7 states and all the 7 regions. And I've seen evidence of the reforms producing impact in people's lives and the reforms not producing impact in people's lives. So when I go to Kayin in the southeast, I meet villagers who are telling me how happy they are that now with the peace agreement, with the ceasefire agreement, finally their daughters can travel the road to this next school 5 miles or 2 miles away. This was not an opportunity they had before, and this is not something that is often touted as the achievement of the reform, but that's an important achievement. The peace in the ethnic areas, while not fully kind of enforced, at least where there's been cessation of hostilities, have opened up these opportunities for human development. I've also seen women, say in Mandalay, who are brave leaders of the local non-governmental organizations, who would have never had a chance in the past regime to advocate on behalf of the sex workers or advocate on behalf of vulnerable female-led communities. So these are some of the elements where the reforms, some of the examples rather, where the reforms had actually led to tangible change in people's lives. But there is an equal number, if not more, number of anecdotes that I can share, anybody else who knows the country can share, where the reforms might have, or the process of the change might have opened up new tensions. For example, the issue of the land grabbing. Now with the market economy, with the investments pouring in, the land grabbing is becoming an issue. And the first one who are on the front line to lose out of the land grabbing is female-led households. So these people don't see any positive benefits of the reform. And there is a need for both the government and all the partners to recognize that whatever economic trajectory the country will take in the next few years, the benefits of the economic growth need to trickle down to the vast majority of the population. So I think there are examples on both sides, but it's important that regardless of these positive or not so positive changes, the expectations are going in leaps and bounds. So it will be very important for the government to continue to ensure that the reforms are staying firmly on track, and they appear to be very committed for the reforms to stay on track. And the role of the development community is to provide the best expertise possible so that they have all the knowledge, all the skills, everything they need to have in order for them to carry out on the reform process, not us do the reforms for them.
Right. Is there also a need, though, to temper expectations to some degree? It seems like there's so much enthusiasm about Myanmar, potential for private investment, potential for democratic reform. Does the international community have a role to play to, urge everyone to sort of take a step back and say, these things take time, don't expect too much too quickly? And is that happening?
There needs to be an engagement. There needs to be always a two-way communication between all the protagonists in the change process. The government, people outside of the government, the communities, the development partners, so on. So that's important. That engagement may or may not be useful for tempering expectations. Tempering expectations may or may not be objective, but that engagement, the two-way communication itself, is very important, because in the absence of that, then there's a real risk that either the expectations will be frustrated or they will be taken to the next level.
Right.
But I think also on this same note, I think we should also recognize that, as I had said a few minutes ago, I mean, the government possibly went as far as fast as they could. So going forward, it's important for them to consolidate the reforms and make sure that the reforms result in actual changes in people's lives.
Great, great. So, as you know, our Devex audience is composed of development professionals and a lot of the organizations who are now getting involved in Myanmar, some of them for the first time. I wonder if you could comment, have you seen any common attributes among organizations working in Myanmar that has made them successful? Is there something that you could say, you know, an organization looking to become involved in this environment or looking to scale up its programs in this environment, you know, here's something that will help you be successful? Can you identify any sort of common thread of success that's shared by these NGOs and companies?
Well, I mean, your question certainly plays up to my ego. I mean, I wish I would know at least part of the answer to that question. I think, Michael, in case of Myanmar, but arguably also in case of the other countries, while there isn't one formula of success, I think from experience, from evidence, we know that what works best is the development solutions that are fully sufficiently customized to the national context. I mean, development is always context sensitive. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's good to have commitment. It's good to be eager to contribute to the change, but we need to recognize that ultimately it's the national stakeholders who need to be in charge, and it's up for them either to transplant experiences from other countries and customize them to their own soil, as it were, or to develop their own development or reform solutions. So I've seen that the development actors that have allowed for the leadership role of the local actors, not just the government but also civil society, they are more likely to contribute to the long-lasting impact of the sustainable results.
Great. And on a sort of similar note, I mean, you do have a lot of organizations that are now working in Myanmar that have never worked there before, and then similarly government ministries that have never worked with this huge array of NGOs and donor agencies that are now becoming involved. Granted, UNDP has been involved all along, so maybe you have a relationship that, you know, has been sustained and strengthened over time. But what can be done to sort of build that collective expertise that can lead to a more effective partnership between the development community and the people and government of Myanmar, given that in many cases they haven't worked together before?
I think at this point in time, Michael, we're mostly, I mean, this is my personal opinion,
sure,
but I would describe it as we're in the phase where the government, the development partners, need to accumulate a critical mass of engagements. Because as you've alluded in your question, there haven't been any bridges between the government and development partners for so long. Mm-hmm. So now that there is this real possibility and opportunity, the government needs to learn how to engage with the development partners, but also development partners need to learn how to engage with the government, not necessarily always come with solutions that work well elsewhere. So it seems that in a number of critical reform areas, there is that critical engagement, critical mass of engagements in place. But probably more could be done to sort of accumulate that knowledge base and then to try to institutionalize the engagements. We've been doing a lot of ad hoc stuff, but there is no, no value judgment. Ad hoc work is very important. Mm-hmm. But we've simply had no other option. At the beginning of the reform process, we had no other option to commit ourselves with the government to the institutional kind of process of engagement. So we had to do ad hoc. But as we're accumulating the ad hoc knowledge and expertise and critical mass of engagements, it seems we're rapidly reaching a stage where the interaction needs to be better institutionalized. The development community and the government are looking carefully at how best to do it. So one landmark, as it were, in this area is the Naypyidaw Accord on Effective Development Cooperation that was approved at the beginning of last year, 2013. And that has then resulted in the establishment of 17 sector working groups, where the government actors and bilateral, multilateral partners are engaging each other and using that as a space, at least to compare their notes, if not to articulate joint programs. So this is a positive institutional development. We've seen a lot of commitment from both the government and development partner side to make sure that those mechanisms are functioning. But as we're going ahead, it will be important that those sector working groups or other such similar mechanisms provide space for meaningful participation by the civil society as well, with the local or international NGOs. Because we feel if the dialogue is only going to take place between the official actors, then we're missing out a big part of the picture. And perhaps if Myanmar were to derive their advantage as the latecomer, perhaps we should also from the outset try to make sure that those institutional mechanisms of coordination, information sharing, are also inclusive not just of the civil society, but the whole area of other development actors, those who are often referred to as non-traditional development partners, the neighbors of Myanmar, as well as private sector and philanthropies. Mm-hmm. So I think we're at the cusp of all those developments. If one is more hopeful as I am, I think we're at the cusp of those developments. But we certainly see this as an important agenda.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, is the next step more engagement, or is it more targeted engagement? You know, is the question that I'm driving towards is we do hear that, you know, there is some danger of simply overwhelming Myanmar with NGOs, with new donors, with new programs. And it sounds like you're describing a way of sort of making sure that those relationships are, as you said, institutionalized, but also channeled to the right places and the right people so that they can be sort of organized and the knowledge generated from them captured. But I wonder, just in terms of the sheer amount of time that it takes, do you think that there's too much engagement now or not enough or the right amount and it just needs to be captured institutionally? Where are we on that spectrum?
I do believe we need to be careful to avoid that engagement generates additional transaction costs or coordination costs. So again, going back to the example of the sector working groups, eventually they will need to serve as a place that's not only information sharing, but also defining the division of labor between the development partners or defining the joint programs or sector-wide approaches. So I believe that will be important for the next few months of engagement between the government and the development partners. The name of the game is really going to be whether those sector working groups or other forms of engagement are actually contributing to the reduced transaction costs. Mm-hmm. So that is an important part of the agenda, I believe, from now onwards. Reaching out to other partners is also very important because, yes, there is a risk that the traditional development partners and NGOs may or may not overburden with their demands or with their requests to the government. But there's also a risk that non-traditional development partners going through their own channels, working through their own programs, might also contribute to additional transaction costs. Mm-hmm. So that's why we believe that this issue of making sure that those mechanisms are inclusive of all the partners, it's not really a matter of choice, but a matter of necessity. And again, as you know, the global development discourse has progressed far way down that path. So the advantage of the situation in Myanmar, notwithstanding all these challenges, and notwithstanding that all of these reforms are quite a tall order, is that Myanmar can learn from the experiences of other countries in Southeast Asia and try to bypass some of the same mistakes that we've seen happening in other countries.
Great. So given that tremendous importance of partnership and inclusive partnerships that coordinate the sort of development effort and bring everybody on board, what does the UNDP look for in potential partners, be they NGOs or do you do much partnership with private companies? Maybe that's a slightly different angle, but in thinking about a good partner in Myanmar for the goals that you're trying to achieve, what are you looking for?
For us, one critical consideration in the work that we do is that before committing to any program or any initiative, we need to ascertain for ourselves that we have an exit strategy in sight. Development is a long-term phenomenon, and it is not reasonable to expect exit strategies from development interventions over 2 or 3 years. But at least there have to be some elements of exit strategy in place, some elements of the institutional capacity building that would allow UNDP or other development partners eventually to work our way out of those areas of interventions and either move up the value chain or get out of the country. So that is an important consideration. And therefore, in engaging with the partners, we believe it is important that jointly with the partners we identify those institutional elements, those elements of exit strategy that should be, if not the end result, but at least an important sort of side effect of our development intervention. In that sense, we welcome more partnership with local civil society organizations, or with the local governments for that matter, because they must be part of any plausible or reasonable exit strategy or institutional capacity in place. And also when engaging other development partners, whether it's in the official realm, the official development agencies, or international non-governmental organizations, to the extent possible, we're trying to remind that we need to keep this issue on the agenda, that we need to engage with each other, partner with each other, but the partnership for the sake of partnership may only get us this far. But partnership for the sake of building institutional capacity of the national stakeholders is something that we should all aspire to achieve.
Right. So you're looking for partners who have that capacity building expertise?
Yeah, who share our commitment and aspiration, yeah.
Great, great. So speaking from your own experience, what have you learned as a leader and a country director about what it takes to be successful in Myanmar? What have been the keys to success in your mind for someone in your position?
Well, I don't think I can speak of success yet. We've just started scratching the surface of some of these areas.
Would be number one.
Yeah, I guess humility would be number one, absolutely. But also, what I found after a year and a half on the job is that there is this potential mistake that we could commit by treating Myanmar as one development context. The development workers, whether working in the UN system or outside, we're sort of pre-programmed. We do the situation analysis, the context analysis first, and then on that basis we then propose the set of interventions. Well, that will not work in Myanmar. In Myanmar, we recognize, and that's the big lesson learned from me, is that there's at least 3 or 4 unique sets of development contexts. There's a context of Rakhine, and to some extent Kachin, the context of ongoing humanitarian hardship and ongoing hostilities, less so in Kachin now, thankfully, but more in Rakhine, that has its own unique characteristics and features. Then there is the context of the southeast and the east of Myanmar. The ethnic areas with the government and ethnic groups have signed a ceasefire agreement, so there wasn't much of the open hostilities in the recent past, but the peace remains somewhat fragile, and there is a need to ensure that, again, I apologize for using cliche, the communities are the beneficiaries of the peace dividend. I mentioned to you the example of the Kayin family that was so happy that their daughter can travel to school 5 miles down the road. But there need to be more examples of that sort of nature. And then it's not only about the livelihoods type of interventions at community level, but also larger scale, eventually down the road, investments in the development of those parts of Myanmar. So that is quite different from Rakhine and Kachin. Right. Then there is central Myanmar, the Delta area of Upper Myanmar, predominantly Bamar populated areas, which haven't had open hostilities over the last few years or decades, but that doesn't mean they had no issues, they had no tension. There's a lot of tension at the community level, and there's a lot of also structural poverty issues. So that's a classical LDC context. So whereas you can compare Rakhine and Kachin with other parts of the world which are in crisis, you can compare Southeast to the countries that are recovering out of crisis. The Bamar heartland is more like your typical LDC, least developed country. They have their own unique development concerns and constraints, and they have their own issues that they need to grapple with as they move out. And then finally there's Yangon and Mandalay. And Yangon and Mandalay are not least developed cities at all. These are like booming Southeast Asian cities with vibrant infrastructure, entrepreneurship, but also their own sets of issues in terms of the development of urban infrastructure, access to justice, access to equitable services. So to conclude, this was the biggest lesson for me, that Myanmar is one country, hopefully will become strong and prosperous union, but for now, Myanmar is a country that is made of at least 3 or 4 different development contexts.
Right. And given your position, it sounds then like you are responsible for, in essence, managing multiple development campaigns, really. I mean, you've got, as you said, the humanitarian side, the development side. So do you find yourself struggling to keep all of those demands in balance in terms of the way that you look out on UNDP's programming?
I mean, if there's anything that keeps me awake at night, that's it. How to, in view of those different development contexts, how to make sure that UNDP's support remains focused. We're not spreading ourselves too thinly.
Right.
And we continue to provide assistance where we believe our assistance can be more meaningful. That brings us back to the notion of democratic governance, local governance, and people-oriented development services, or the governance services. So we need to find different applications, different solutions from the governance angle that would apply different in these different development contexts.
Great. Well, Toily, thank you so much. Again, my guest has been Toily Kurbanov, who's the United Nations Development Program's Country Director for Myanmar. Thank you all for joining us.